Afghanistan is known for war. The last 4 decades of its history has pushed this point home, with the country constantly being in the throes of conflict. But there was a time when that wasn't the case. The first 8 decades of the 20th century saw it being a relatively peaceful state that was making steady progress towards modernizing. Under the watchful eye of its monarchy, Afghanistan was developing its infrastructure and working towards becoming an active member of the international community. From the 1930s to the 1970s, the government expanded its capacity and extended the reach of its authority. As a result, the political modernization of the country gained significant momentum during the long reign of King Zahir Shah. The modernizing drive of Afghan policymakers had an all-encompassing impact on the trajectory of the nation. In its desire to bring the country up to speed with the 20th century, the royal family's modernization efforts had a number of unintended consequences that would see Afghanistan become embroiled in Cold War politics and subsequently thrown into violent chaos. The Soviet invasion in the 1980s undid much of the progress that had been made up until that point and left the country destroyed and war-torn. In order to better understand the driving forces behind the socio-political events as well as the policy making that took place in the reign of King Zahir Shah, we briefly need to consider the events at the beginning of the 20th century. At the start of Amir Habibullah's reign, certain prominent families were allowed to return from exile that had settled in the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. The two most notable families were the Tarzis and the Musahibans, Zahir Shah being a member of the latter. Both families were members of the ruling Barakzai dynasty. These families are important because they brought back an array of ideas with them, ranging from pan-Islamism to nationalism to modernization. Soon enough, these ideas were absorbed into the nation's infrastructure in the form of institutional foundations such as the Habibiyya and Harbiyya schools, which were set up with the intention of introducing a modern education, consequently allowing Afghanistan to become in sync with the frequency of ideas permeating much of the modern Islamic world. At the same time as these new waves of ideas were being introduced into the country, Afghans were also grappling with the fact that they were not fully independent. Their foreign policy was controlled by the British Viceroy of India. Such a flagrant imposition on Afghan sovereignty helped to cultivate an energetic nationalist movement that included the intellectual Mahmud Tarzi and Prince Amanullah. In 1919, Amanullah came to the throne and took a more assertive stance than his father, going to war with the British in the same year, in the process securing total Afghan independence. Following on from this, Amanullah spent the rest of his reign trying to rapidly modernize his country, with the aim of making it strong enough so that its sovereignty would not be at risk again. However, this drew the resentment of a vast portion of Afghan society who felt the king was going against certain foundational principles of Afghan culture. As a result, a revolt broke out which forced Amanullah to abdicate in early 1929. The senior member of the Musahiban family, Nader Shah, brought an end to the chaos when he ascended the throne later that year. His reign was to be a short one. The political scene at the time was still divided between pro-Amanullah supporters and pro-Musahiban supporters. In 1933, King Nader Shah was caught up in this power struggle and he was assassinated by a high school student. Typically in Afghan history, the transition phase between one king and another was tumultuous. But that wasn't the case when 19-year-old Zahir Shah succeeded his father. This was because true power was not with the young king. Instead, it was with his three uncles, Sardar Hashim Khan, Sardar Shah Wali Khan, and Sardar Shah Mahmud Khan. They all had key roles within the government and tried to uphold their brother Nadir Shah's vision for a slow-paced modernization program which would not upset the traditional elements of society. And so, for the first 3 decades of his rule, Zahir Shah exercised very little executive authority. It's important to consider that the Musahibans' grip on power was not secure just because of their status as royals. The ulama, the dominant religious class, were in a very powerful position due to their opposition to Amanullah. Therefore, for their own legitimacy, the Musahibans had to secure their approval. They did this by giving the religious establishment a large degree of influence over civic and criminal law. These concessions were institutionalized in the 1931 Constitution. All of this naturally required the Musahibans to disavow the radical social reforms that King Amanullah had committed himself to. Nevertheless, the fact that they officially distanced themselves from those social reforms does not mean they disagreed with them. From interviews given to European newspapers before his death, we can see that Nadir Shah was a man with a firm appreciation for modernization. And quote, "The fact that Amanullah's reforms brought his downfall does not prove in any way that they were bad. If in order to cure himself fast, the sick absorbed a potion tenfold stronger than prescribed by the doctor, he certainly may become sicker. That, however, does not prove in any way that the medicine itself was bad." The Musahibans were endowed with a modernist education, which they would have been introduced to during the decades in exile they spent in British India. But in order not to ruffle the feathers of the conservative elements of society, during the prime ministership of the eldest uncle Hashim Khan, the government focused upon a modernization program which almost completely revolved around trying to enhance their state-building capacity. It did this mainly by trying to improve their military capabilities. This helped in 2 ways. Firstly, military modernization allowed the royal family to channel the modernizing drive that was becoming apparent amongst the increasing amount of graduates from modern institutions in that direction. Therefore, neither the modernists nor the traditionalists could complain. Secondly, it would strengthen the government's own authority since the army was an instrument of their power. And later on, if they did want to enact social reforms which would have drawn the anger of the traditionalists, at least they would have had a strong army at their disposal to push the reforms through. Tied to this focus on enhancing state-building capacity was the development of communication between the capital and the far-flung rural areas. This would allow the government to have a more direct role in those areas, partly through the establishment of roads that could enable a freer movement of troops which could then be used in the event of an uprising or revolt. Thus, the army would be used as a means to maintain domestic stability. All this focus on material rather than social modernization worked to the Musahibans' favour, because their very ascension to power occurred as a result of them being able to provide order in a chaotic environment. British military reports from the mid-1930s show that their power base was not underpinned by ideology so much, but by their ability to offer social stability and prosperity. As the 1930s progressed, the pro-Amanullah faction lost much of its prominence, thereby giving the government breathing room to focus on its economic modernization program. As a result of negative experiences with the British and Imperial Russia, Afghanistan turned to the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, for loans and expertise. This brings us to perhaps the most important factor in the reign of Zahir Shah for shaping the policies of the Afghan government: World War II. This might be surprising to hear, considering Afghanistan remained neutral throughout the war. But the Second World War forced a few pivotal realizations amongst the Afghans. For starters, the war placed drastic financial burdens on the populace, which triggered certain consequential debates within the intelligentsia. The price of basic items skyrocketed. House rent increased by 313%, clothing by 325%, foodstuffs by 361%, and all prices on average went up by 355%. As a result, World War II convinced Afghan modernists that reform was no longer a matter of ideological conviction. It was a matter of survival. Another important factor to consider is that although the misfortune Afghans experienced as a result of World War II wasn't necessarily the fault of the Afghan monarchy, it did raise questions of legitimacy regarding the royal family's ability to provide for the people's needs. In an evocation of the 18th century French Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's famous social contract, the more progressive elements of the Afghan intelligentsia seem to have begun questioning the Musahibans' right to rule if they could not solve the country's staggering socio-economic woes. At the same time, the demand of the Soviet Union and Britain to cut ties with Germany and Italy in October 1941, a demand they had made under military threat to Iran and Iraq in the same year, would certainly have contributed to the perception that the country's independence lay on a knife's edge. And so, worried by the rising spectre of social upheaval, the Musahibans were forced to abandon their cautious modernization program. In 1946, the uncompromising Hashim Khan stepped down as Prime Minister and was replaced by his more open brother, Shah Mahmud. To offset a potential power grab by the country's intelligentsia, who were agitating for greater social and political reform, the monarchy decided to delegate a degree of authority to some form of representational democracy that incorporated the intelligentsia. This led to what has been referred to as the First Democratic Period. Whilst the economic impact of World War II may have been the trigger that the intelligentsia required to push for a system of governance that adhered to Rousseau's social contract, the intellectual tools required to appreciate the demands of the people on the monarchy were rooted in a longer-term trend that began with the reforms carried out by Amir Habibullah and especially King Amanullah to build the educational infrastructure. The most prominent political movement that came about in the First Democratic Period was the Were The Translated from Pashto as Awakened Youth, it formed in 1947. Most of its most prominent members were recruited from the major literary institutions. The movement had a broad agenda that was united by a liberal outlook which sought to enact political and social reforms. In 1949, the government announced that there would be parliamentary elections. The new MPs were electrified by the prospect of having a practical impact on the way the country was run. But as is often the case in third world countries that transition from an absolutist government to a representative one, the transition was not well handled. The MPs' newfound power saw them try to introduce a torrent of new changes, which the political status quo was not willing to tolerate. In 1951, Liberal MPs in Parliament passed a law which ensured the freedom of press, meaning that journalists could have virtually complete freedom in what they wrote about. Naturally, this led to many uncomfortable conversations. By 1953, the government had enough and ended Parliament. The last straw was when the MPs started to criticize the royal family itself. In order to assert its presence on the scene and stabilize the political situation, the royal family elevated the king's autocratic cousin, Sardar Muhammad Daud Khan, to the position of Prime Minister in 1953. The mention of the Were Zalmian brings up an interesting and controversial topic within modern Afghan history, and that is the apparently prejudiced policies in favor of the Pashtun ethnic group. Within a very short space of time, the Were Zalmian fractured into various groups. A key reason for this was the movement's official support for Pashtunistan. Pashtunistan is a reference to calls for an independent state in the area of the newly created Pakistan that was dominated by the Pashtuns and was separated from Afghanistan by the Durand Line in 1893. For this reason, the Were Zalmian was criticized for having a Pashtun ethno-nationalist tone by some of its non-Pashtun members. This criticism has similarly been leveled at the Afghan royal family as well, who besides being Pashtuns themselves, patronized and cultivated the Pashtunistan idea. Pashtun nationalism was certainly an ideological force throughout the middle of the 20th century, both in Afghanistan and across the border in Pakistan. Nonetheless, whilst at face value the ethno-nationalist criticism of the Were Zalmian and the royal family is tough to undermine, we can get a more nuanced understanding of the context behind this outlook if we explore the events surrounding this period. For many liberal Afghan politicians and intellectuals, the Pashtunistan issue was used as a vehicle for undermining the autocracy of the Afghan monarchy. The critique of human rights in the new state of Pakistan opened up a discursive space for discussion of the same topic in Afghanistan. In 1948, the Pakistani ambassador in Kabul tried explaining this very thing to the Afghan royal family, telling them that their official support for the self-determination of Pakistani Pashtuns would invariably arouse questions amongst the Afghan populace for their own rights to representation, in the face of a monarchy that failed to give its people a voice in the government. For the Musahibans, the Pashtunistan issue was used as an opportunity to enact their vision of modernization on a tribal nation. The primary form of opposition to the monarchy had always been the forces of conservatism, epitomized by the tribes and the ulama. With the Pashtun tribes proving to be a formidable counterpart to government authority, the Pashtunistan issue was utilized by the Musahibans as a means of gaining the support of the powerful Pashtun tribes within the country, whilst at the same time distracting those same conservative elements of society from the social and political modernization measures that they wanted to introduce. After 1953, the iron-fisted Prime Minister Daud Khan would use the issue as a means of raising a strong army that could reinforce the authority of the central government under the guise of being able to protect the nation's sovereignty against a belligerent neighbor. A member of the younger generation of the Musahibans, Daud Khan shared the outlook of many of the nation's progressives who wanted a quicker pace to modernization. Where he differed from the progressives was in his personal style of rule. Daud preferred to govern autocratically and has been described by many as a strongman ruler. Over the next 10 years, in a period known as Daud's decade, Afghanistan's economy gained a massive boost. The country had already put itself in an advantageous position because by 1945 it had accrued around $100 million in reserves thanks to the trade in Karakul. This money would be put to use in funding the modernizing projects of the 1950s and 60s. At the same time, Afghanistan benefited economically from the Cold War rivalry between the USA and the USSR. Even before the 1950s, these two states were competing with each other to gain the support of non-partisan Third World countries. This led to the advocacy of a notion called developmentalism, which posited that it was the moral duty of well-developed states to help underdeveloped countries in the form of developmental aid. Prime Minister Daud would have cared little about the ideological conflict between communism and capitalism. Rather, he welcomed the prospect of rapid economic development which could ensure his country's independence. In an interview with the famed American scholar of Afghan culture and history, Louis Dupree, Daud encapsulated the urgency of Afghan modernists when he stated, "Afghanistan is a backward country. We must do something about it or die as a nation." It is within this context that Afghanistan's economy was effectively organized post-World War II to become aid-dependent. For instance, the USA built a dam in Helmand during the 1950s and 60s, which aimed to instrumentalize the Helmand River's capacity to generate energy. Whilst the Soviets in 1955 rolled out $100 million in credit that would facilitate Soviet engineers to construct factories, dams, airports, and highways. The country's rulers were obliged to utilize their historic location on the crossroads of Asia to find the best deal for their country by playing a game of accepting aid from both superpowers but not preferring one over the other. Over time, this proved to be a dangerous game, which helped lead to the Afghan-Soviet War of the 1980s. Because another aspect of the Afghan government's desire to modernize was to send young university students out to countries like the Soviet Union and America to gain knowledge that the students could then bring back and use for the progress of Afghanistan. After World War II, there were certain strands of Afghan society, especially within the university students and army officers, who were familiarizing themselves with divergent strands of ideological thought, such as liberalism and communism. The communist students and army officers who traveled abroad to the Soviet Union for training would foment greater ties with the communist superpower, and in time, these close ties would serve them once the communists gained power inside Afghanistan. In addition, in 1965, Nur Muhammad Tarakay, along with Babrak Karmal and others, set up the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or the PDPA, a Marxist-Leninist political party that presented their political outlook within the framework of a class struggle. The PDPA soon fractured into two main factions, Khalq being the more radical one, and Parcham being known as the more moderate of the two. Despite all this economic growth, Prime Minister Daud's antagonism with Pakistan over the Pashtunistan issue was evidently costing the Afghans. The tension eventually culminated in border closures between the two neighbours, which placed a major strain on the Afghan economy. Emboldened by Daud's loss of support amongst many members of the royal family and the wider intelligentsia, in 1963, King Zahir Shah facilitated a scenario where Daud resigned as Prime Minister. This brought about the Constitutional Decade, a period which, similar to the Liberal Parliament era, was characterized by increased political dynamism but also greater political chaos as well. Taking a more assertive role for the first time in his 30-year reign, King Zahir Shah sought to form a government that would introduce Afghans to what he called New Democracy, which would have Dr. Muhammad Yusuf, a non-royal, as Prime Minister. It was specifically in this period that the ideas that had previously been generated and subsequently proliferated by the Weghzalmian and wider intelligentsia gained an added layer of prominence because Dr. Yusuf's cabinet was called the Cabinet of Educationalists, since many of its members were drawn from major literary and educational institutions such as Kabul University. The most striking culmination of liberal ideas being propagated by the intelligentsia and reformist politicians was the 1964 Constitution, which finally answered the call for a constitutional monarchy that was first evoked at the beginning of the 20th century. This monumental piece of legislation was made possible by the Constitutional Coalition, a group that included the king, the educated elite, the traditional elite, and certain elements of the royal family. However, once the fear of Daud's political prominence subsided, the coalition fragmented and a growing sense of anarchy perpetuated throughout the constitutional decade. Amid the increased political upheaval, there were four main strains of thought that could be detected amongst the newly active parliament. The traditionalists, who favoured a strong emphasis on Afghan culture and the retaining of Islamic principles. The adopters, wanting to fuse Western technology with Afghan culture. The Democrats, who sought a democratic republic. And the Marxist-Leninists, who were theoretically compelled to the revolutionary overthrow of a non-communist government. These ideological viewpoints gained greater exposure through various publications that came to the surface as a result of the 1965 press law. But any benefits that could be wrought from the proliferation of publications were undermined by the lack of official parties in parliamentary elections. Instead, the elections revolved around individuals, which hastened the fragmentation of the Walasi Jargah, or the lower house of parliament. The confusion was heightened by the Marxist-Leninists, whose publication was shut down for espousing anti-monarchic views, and they subsequently used their support amongst the university students of Kabul to utilize obstructionist tactics that included more than 2,000 strikes, demonstrations, and protests. The rise of communist political activity drew a conservative reaction from the ulama as well, a trend that would reach its apotheosis during the Afghan Jihad in the 1980s. To confound matters, a series of ecological disasters in the late 1960s and early 1970s that included famine and drought further undermined the government's credibility because of its failure to successfully mitigate the impact on the people. This led to a situation by 1971 in which the scholar Dupree predicted that revolution would seem no more than a decade away. Within 5 years, the first abortive coup may occur. Most likely it will emanate from the idealistic, unrealistic left. Robert G. Newman, the US ambassador, was even more negative, claiming in 1972 that the survival of King Zahir Shah beyond a year was, quote, problematical. His words would prove prophetic. In 1973, whilst the king was away on medical treatment in Italy, his cousin and ex-Prime Minister Daud staged a bloodless coup that toppled the monarchy and replaced it with a republic that had him at the helm. The Afghan monarchy had ruled for 250 years, a line of tradition that had begun with the 18th century conqueror Ahmad Shah Durrani and ended with Zahir Shah, the last king of Afghanistan. Although he was a member of the Musahiban royal family, President Dawood's reign would be a radical departure from the past. Many of the underlying currents that were the consequence of Afghanistan's modernizing drive would be sped up and assume a more turbulent tempo. The most destructive element of the coup was who he collaborated with, because, in doing this, he was helped by the communist PDPA and their Soviet-trained military officers who had infiltrated the government and army. This alliance was viewed very negatively by the increasingly outspoken Islamist activists who were ideologically antagonistic to communism. In addition to this, Daud Khan reignited a rivalry with Pakistan that was largely focused on his irredentist desires to reclaim territories lost to the British in 1893, which was subsequently inherited by Pakistan upon its creation in 1947. These territories within Pakistan were inhabited by the Pashtun ethnic group, the dominant ethnic group in Afghanistan politically and demographically. In response to President Dawood's subversive activities within Pakistan, the ISI, the Secret Service of Pakistan, began to give funding and training to prominent Islamists such as Gulbuddin Hikmatyar and Burhanuddin Rabbani in their anti-government activities. This materialized into an Islamist uprising in 1975 that was put down by the Afghan government. In time, Dawood's coalition with the communists disintegrated, to devastating consequences. In 1977, he proclaimed a new constitution and called a new cabinet which was devoid of appointments for members of the two factions of the PDPA, Khalq and Parcham. In fact, he actively sought out to minimize the influence of communist members that had helped him in his 1973 coup. Dawood had even made attempts to reconcile himself with certain Islamic fundamentalist leaders, but the Khalqis and Parchamis had a solid power base amongst army officers and had helped their cause by unifying the two factions in 1977. By 1978, Dawood had left himself in a position where he had no power base and was opposed by a wide array of forces that ranged from Islamic fundamentalists to liberal university students. This provided the perfect opportunity for the communists to overthrow him. And so in April 1978, the PDPA launched the Saur Revolution, in which Dawood, along with his family, lost their lives, and a communist state was established in Afghanistan. The PDPA, under the leadership of the Khalqist Nur Muhammad Tarakay, immediately set about to bring widespread changes to Afghan society. These changes, such as land reforms and the emancipation of women, were intended to rapidly modernize Afghan society, something which other Afghan rulers had tried to do in the 20th century, such as King Amanullah in the 1920s. But the PDPA went even further, attacking practices and traditions which they viewed as feudal. This antagonistic approach to certain elements of tradition was extended to Islam as well. The PDPA's outlook seemed to be rooted in a desire to vindicate the famous Marxist statement, "Religion is the opium of the masses." The socio-cultural makeup of Afghanistan meant that the new leadership was on a collision course with the majority of its citizens. Ordinary Afghans resented and resisted what they viewed as a forced attempt to change their identity, especially since it required them to sever connections with the most important element of their culture, Islam. Throughout the countryside, more and more families were migrating to Iran and Pakistan, whilst an Islamist rebel movement in the form of the Mujahideen was growing in strength, undoubtedly helped by the significant number of defecting army soldiers. The Mujahideen meant those who engage in jihad, or holy struggle, and they portrayed themselves as being the opponents of the quote-unquote un-Islamic communists. The general discontent with the PDPA only served to fuel the cause of the Mujahideen. There were several spontaneous uprisings around the country, the most famous of which took place in the city of Herat in March 1979, where a popular uprising with the support of mutinying army soldiers took control of one of the most important cities in the country. The communist government's response was ruthless. Thousands were killed as they reclaimed control over the city. The rising strength of anti-government forces, as well as the bad decisions made by the PDPA, worried the Soviet Union, the key ally of the Afghan communists. In September 1979, there was a power struggle within the Khalq faction, and President Tarakay was removed from power and later executed by his successor, Hafizullah Amin. Amin was far more defiant and independently minded than Tarakay was. Whilst he was a committed communist, the new leader was more interested in putting Afghan sovereignty first and foremost. To the horror of the Soviets, Amin seemed to have even been trying to improve relations with the Americans. As a result, his relationship with the USSR was rapidly deteriorating. By December, the Soviets had to make a decision to get directly involved and stabilize the situation in favor of their allies, or risk letting the communist government collapse. It should be stated that the Soviets did not want to intervene directly in Afghanistan. They demonstrated that repeatedly throughout 1978 and 1979, when even though the PDPA asked for direct military help, the Soviets refused. The two sides had actually signed a friendship treaty in December 1978, which allowed the Afghan communist government to call on the Soviets for military help. But Afghanistan was not of major international importance to the USSR, and it was obvious that the conservative country would be hostile to their military presence. What ended up changing their mind is not known for sure. One can only speculate. The Iranian Revolution that had happened earlier in 1979 would justifiably have given the Soviet leadership cause for concern for their own internal stability. The Soviet Union had a number of Muslim republics in Central Asia under its control at the time. Therefore, an Islamist Iranian revolution in conjunction with a rising Islamist movement in Afghanistan under the Mujahideen would not have boded well for the peace of mind of Soviet policymakers. In this time, the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, had been suffering from a variety of ailments, meaning that by the late 1970s, he was helped significantly by the trio of Yuri Andropov, Dmitry Ustinov, and Andrei Gromyko. In December 1979, the Soviet leadership decided upon a short intervention in Afghanistan that would stabilize the government, partly by replacing President Amin with the more moderate Parchami Babrak Karmal. A key failure of the Soviets in their decision-making process was in the way that they viewed Afghanistan. To the Soviet higher-ups, Afghanistan was only seen in the context of the Cold War. This meant that they largely viewed the Mujahideen uprising against the PDPA as being something that was stoked and sponsored by their Cold War rivals, the Americans. This strategic lack of insight would prove fatal for the Soviets, as they failed to understand that the majority of Afghans were actually against the ideas and policies of the PDPA. And it was this, not American encouragement, that gave rise to the Mujahideen. Bearing this in mind will help us understand why Afghanistan is referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1979, Soviet forces started moving into the country under the pretext of a pre-existing friendship treaty. They quickly pinpointed key centers of telecommunication with the aim of disabling the communications network, so that the Soviets could take hold of the capital Kabul and carry out Operation Storm 333 3 days later. This was the name given to the operation under which President Amin was assassinated by Soviet Special Forces, aka the Spetsnaz, in the Tajbek Palace. The daring operation was a remarkable success, carried out in just 40 minutes. The very next day, the Soviets brought in Babrak Karmal, perceived to be a more moderate communist, as Afghanistan's new president. By the beginning of 1980, approximately 80,000 Soviet troops had poured into the country through 2 ground routes and 1 air corridor. Their instructions were to take control of the major urban centers and highways inside the country. The reaction of the international community was largely unanimous.
No words, therefore, which I shall say today can fully convey the deep sense of disappointment and disillusion which the government and people of Nigeria felt when they heard the news of Soviet armed intervention in Afghanistan, a third world developing non-aligned country which posed no immediate threat to the peace and security of the Soviet Union.
Most of the Islamic world strongly condemned the Soviet actions.
Actually, the Soviet invasion does not represent anything but imperialist expansion, aimed at establishing and consolidating a communist rule against the will of the peaceful Muslim Afghan people.
Whilst the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution protesting against the Soviet invasion by a vote of 104 to 18. The Soviets stated that it was a legitimate intervention since they were obliging aid requested by the official Afghan government. However, the international community was not convinced by this. Why would President Amin invite the Soviets in to kill him and topple his government? The reaction of the Afghan people was similarly unanimous. The Soviet military's presence did not have the desired effect the Bolshevik high command was seeking. Instead of bringing security and stability, it invoked a deep-seated hostility to the idea of a foreign invasion within the Afghans. The British had had first-hand experience with the patriotic fervour of the Afghans during the 19th century. Now that Islam was also under attack, in the eyes of the Muslim population, there was no way that the Soviets could have the early withdrawal that they wanted. The unpopularity of this war amongst the Afghans served as the perfect recruitment tool for the Mujahideen groups, the most prominent of which established their headquarters across the border in Pakistan. Throughout the course of the war, roughly 6 million Afghans were forced to flee the country. That's around a third of the entire country. In fact, there are some that estimate that half of the world's refugees in the 1980s were Afghan, with more than 3 million moving to Pakistan, whilst around 2 million fled to Iran. These refugee camps, especially the ones in Pakistan, served as focal centers of recruitment for the cause of jihad. It should be specified that this migration was not merely an ideological reaction to the infidel Soviets. Rather, a significant amount of it was due to Soviet military tactics and practices. Initially, the situation was characterized by the Soviets being content with their enclave strategy. That is, they were committed to defending major cities and roads, whilst avoiding large-scale pacification campaigns in the countryside, which was largely controlled by the Mujahideen. But soon after, the Soviets started to favor more of an aggressive policy that went hand in hand with President Karmal's calls in 1982 for a campaign called From City to Village, which would try to extend communist control from the provincial centers out to the rural areas. Naturally, this led to an intensification of conflict. The Soviets would attack villages that they suspected of harboring the Mujahideen. A lot of the times, the villagers were unfortunate that the Mujahideen attacked a Soviet convoy near their village, which subsequently led to Soviet reprisal attacks on civilians. According to the eminent Afghan historian Muhammad Hassan Kakar, the Afghans were the victims of a deliberate attempt at genocide. He states, "The claim of the Soviet Union that it dispatched its limited contingent to repulse foreign aggression proved groundless after the uprising of February 1980, when its war machine began to kill not only the Mujahideen, but also defenseless civilians throughout the country." Frustrated by the tough resistance and their inability to suppress it expeditiously, the Soviets embarked on a program of genocide. Whilst this statement may seem exaggerated, there was certainly a conscious effort on the Soviet leadership's part to intimidate the countryside into submission. This included indiscriminate massacres, rape, forced depopulation, the destruction of crops and irrigation, leaving millions of mines scattered across the country, some of them being booby traps disguised as children's toys. In conjunction with this, the communist Afghan secret police, Khad, was also especially feared and despised throughout the country. Rather than breaking the morale of the Afghan people and Mujahideen, these heavy-handed tactics only served to reinforce their stubborn resistance. Even though the rugged and determined nature of the Mujahideen would prove to be the bedrock of the Afghan path to victory, it is impossible to undermine the importance of the role played by foreign countries in supporting their efforts. Within the Afghan resistance, the Americans saw an opportunity to undermine their Cold War rivals. And so began Operation Cyclone, one of the biggest and longest covert CIA operations ever, where America sent financial aid to the Mujahideen. To shed more light on this, we now go to Cypher from Cynical Historian.
The United States and the rest of NATO immediately protested the Soviet invasion. 65 countries boycotted the 1980 Olympics, including communist China and Albania. The Warsaw Pact returned the favor by boycotting the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. President Jimmy Carter, in a startling flash of decisive action for once, began funneling funds to the Mujahideen, starting with $30 million. By 1987, that number rose to $630 million. American policymakers, like CIA Chief William Casey and Congressman Charlie Wilson, lobbied for this increase, which newly elected President Ronald Reagan was all too happy to authorize. Reagan was a Cold Warrior and used the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan to turn funding from welfare programs to the military in order to fight what he called the evil empire. During the 1985 State of the Union address, he said,
"We must stand by all our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua to defy Soviet-supported aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth. Support for freedom fighters is self-defense."
This was the Reagan Doctrine, and it dictated U.S. support of the Mujahideen.
It should be mentioned that the Americans were extremely careful and measured in extending their military support to the Mujahideen. The idea of Afghanistan becoming the USSR's Vietnam was not so enthusiastically embraced by the American political machine at the beginning of the conflict. And for good reason. For starters, unlike America and Vietnam, the Soviet Union actually shared a border with the Afghans, thus reducing potential logistical issues. Also, the Soviets, along with their Russian Empire predecessors, had a rich history of invasions, giving them an advantage in expertise. And lastly, the issue of human casualties in a war was not a regime-shaking matter for the authoritarian Bolsheviks. So for the first few years of the war, the Americans were cautious about leaving their footprint in Afghanistan, fearing that if the resistance fails, it would become another blow to them, which would mean that the Vietnam Syndrome, the American public's aversion to involvement in overseas conflicts, would not only not heal, but it would actually get even worse. Therefore, the more the Afghan resistance endured and strengthened, the more the USA would increase their military assistance. American aid was funneled to the Mujahideen through the conduit of the ISI, the Pakistani Secret Service. The Pakistani government, under the military general, President Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, threw its full weight of support behind the Afghan resistance, accommodating the millions of refugees and providing training camps for the Mujahideen. General Zia skillfully used the Afghan issue for his own political ambition by gripping on to absolute power for 10 years. At the same time, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan served Zia's national interests as well, since it deflected attention away from the nuclear program which Pakistan was actively pursuing. Saudi Arabia was another major contributor to the Mujahideen cause. Officially, they stated that they would match the USA's financial aid. Iran played a key role in helping the Shia Mujahideen factions, especially from the Hazara ethnic group. The Communist government of China was also involved in aiding the Mujahideen against their fellow communist rivals, the Soviets. Interestingly, what is often downplayed is the role played by private donations. Journalist Jason Burke references an interview with the head of the ISI during the war, Hamid Gul, and states that as little as 25% of the money for the Afghan jihad was actually supplied directly by states. The resolve of the Mujahideen and the foreign aid combined to create a clinical and effective force that the Soviets and their Afghan communist allies could not contain. The Mujahideen ensured that this would be an Afghan-style war, one which saw the tough mountainous terrain of the country being used to produce a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. It is tough to know for sure their true strength of numbers, but it is estimated that the Mujahideen had up to 250,000 fighters. They specialized in hit-and-run tactics, as well as ambushing convoys. Whilst they started out with the outdated Enfield rifles, the Afghan Mujahideen moved on to the now iconic AK-47 Kalashnikovs as their favored weapon. A particularly menacing foe for them was the Soviet gunships, such as the Mi-24 Hind gunships that were used in search and destroy operations. This issue was tackled by the Americans, who in 1986 started supplying the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles, which were heat-seeking missiles that were shot at Soviet gunships. Some analysts viewed the introduction of these surface-to-air missiles as a game changer, going on to coin the term the Stinger effect, although their effectiveness is debated by others. Whilst on the ground, the Mujahideen had operational agency to determine their best course of action within their small groups, the wider movement did have political leaders that formed their own parties which the Mujahideen would then affiliate themselves with. The Pakistani-based Peshawar 7 was by far the most important group of parties in the war effort. They were supported by America, Saudi Arabia, and of course, Pakistan. The most prominent party of the Peshawar 7 was the Hizb-e Islami, an Islamist group led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. This group received the lion's share of the aid from America, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. But the group's leader, Hekmatyar, has received intense criticism throughout the years for being an extremist that was more focused on enlarging his own influence than the cause of defeating the Soviets. According to CIA officer Graham Fuller, he spent a lot more of his time fighting other Mujahideen than killing Soviets. He has been accused on numerous occasions of ordering assassinations and attacks on other Mujahideen factions during the war. In this regard, Hekmatyar is often juxtaposed with Ahmad Shah Massoud, a commander for the Jamiyat-e Islami party. The charismatic Massoud was lionized by the Western media for his tactical brilliance in guerrilla warfare as the Lion of Panjshir. The Wall Street Journal published an editorial about Massoud in 1992 titled "The Afghan Who Won the Cold War." But Massoud's track record seems to be as murky as Hekmatyar's. Throughout the war, Massoud was criticized by other Mujahideen parties for making deals with the Soviets. In 1983, he signed a year-long truce with the Soviets where he agreed to not attack Soviet convoys on their way through the pivotal Salang Tunnel from Soviet Central Asia to Kabul. It is tough to understate the importance of the Salang Tunnel for the Soviets. According to General Gromov, the commander of the Soviet 40th Army in Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah could have turned Salang into a Russian graveyard just by throwing rocks. His supporters claimed that he intended to use this time to rebuild his forces and give the war-weary inhabitants of the Panjshir Valley, where he himself was from, a break from the constant major Soviet campaigns in the area. But to his Afghan critics, that doesn't change the fact that Soviet forces could now focus on implementing their harsh and ruthless tactics on Massoud's fellow countrymen and women in other parts of the country. In spite of all this focus on specific leaders, it should not lead us to romanticize their roles. Whereas in reality, the Afghan jihad was too big, too complicated, and had too many major actors for it to be boiled down and essentialized in the manner that Western journalists often portrayed it to be. Massoud's ceasefire with the Soviets is a perfect example of this sloppy portrayal, as well as the multifaceted nuances of the Afghan resistance. How can a man who had a ceasefire with the enemy be regarded as a leader of the resistance? In 1985, the reformist Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the USSR, and the Soviet need to exit Afghanistan gained fresh impetus. In preparation for their withdrawal, the Soviets gave greater responsibility to the Afghan Communist government. In 1986, they replaced President Karmal with Muhammad Najibullah, the former head of the Afghan Secret Service. President Najibullah was clearly given instructions to take a policy of rapprochement with the opposition that would bring an end to hostilities. A program of national reconciliation was put forward, and in 1987 a new constitution was ratified, which amongst other things showed a greater role for Islam in the political outlook of the Afghan communist government. Already severely weakened by thousands of soldiers defecting every year, the Afghan communist government welcomed the idea of a power-sharing scenario with the Mujahideen. But the notion of making peace with a weak puppet communist regime that was ideologically antagonistic to Islam was not enticing for the Mujahideen leadership. Regardless, Gorbachev had to find a way to withdraw from Afghanistan, which he described as a bleeding wound. Finally, in April 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed by Afghanistan, USSR, Pakistan, and America, securing the withdrawal of Soviet forces from the country. The Mujahideen leadership, however, was furious that they were left out of the Geneva talks. By February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldiers had left Afghanistan. They had lost around 15,000 soldiers in the conflict. But the war took an especially heavy toll on Afghanistan. More than 9 years of fighting had left anywhere between 500,000 to 2 million Afghans dead. A third of the population was forced to flee the country, whilst there were more than 1 million Afghans displaced within the country. More than 2 million Afghans were left wounded, a number that was guaranteed to increase even after the Soviets pulled out, because they had left more than 10 million unexploded mines scattered throughout the country. If we consider that Afghanistan had a reported population of about 15 million before the war, we can see that the Afghan-Soviet war subjected most of the nation to becoming a casualty of some form. As for the future of the country, the words of a Soviet captain who served in Afghanistan would prove fateful. Children born in Afghanistan at the start of the war have been brought up in war conditions. This is their way of life. The aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal did not bring an end to war and conflict. In fact, it led to a number of key developments around the world. The USSR, already in the throes of a permanent decline, would collapse within 2 years, and all of its constituent member states would gain independence. As for the Americans, their interest in Afghanistan declined considerably now that their main strategic goal of dealing a blow to their Soviet counterparts was achieved. But it should be noted that up until the fall of the Afghan communist government in 1992, the USA still sent hundreds of millions of dollars in aid money to the Mujahideen. Globally, it is hard to understate the importance of the Afghan-Soviet war to the prominence of militant Islamic fundamentalism that would come to define the 2000s. The most famous example of the link between the two was Osama bin Laden, and how the roots of his terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, can be traced back to the battlefields of Afghanistan, where he fought with the Mujahideen against the Soviet and Afghan communists. As for the Afghans, their woes and anguish were not over. It took 3 years of hard fighting for the Mujahideen to finally bring down the Afghan communist government in 1992. Then, the world watched in horror as the Mujahideen groups immediately turned on each other and initiated a bitter 4-year-long civil war that saw the destruction of the capital, Kabul. And it was only brought to an end in 1996 by the emergence of the Taliban. 41 years after war began in Afghanistan, the country is still in a state of warfare today. Thank you guys for watching, and a special thank you goes out to my Patreons for continuing to support me financially. If you want to do so, click the link in the end screen or in the description to this video, and I would appreciate it a lot. Whatever contribution you can make, that would be awesome. Until next time, peace.